The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins by Dr. Seuss. In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He only had one hat. It was an old one that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. Bartholomew liked it, especially because the feather had pointed straight up in the air. The kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His palace stood high on the top of the mountain. From his balcony, he looked down at his old houses and his subjects. First, over the spires of the noblemen's castles. Across the board roosted the rich men's mansions. Then over the little houses of townsfolk, on the hunts of the farmers off far of the fields. It was mighty view. It made King Derwin feel mighty important. Far off the fields of the edge of the Cranberry Bog stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers and the houses of the townsfolk, then to the rich men's mansions and noblemen's castles, up to the great towering place of the kingdom. It was exactly the same view that the King Derwin saw from his balcony. The Bartholomew saw as backward. It was a mighty view, but it was Bartholomew Cubbins' feel mighty small. Just after sunrise one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for down. He felt very happy. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather in his hat. In his right hand he carried a basket of cranberries to sell to the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring the money back home to his parents. He walked faster and faster until he got home to the gates of town. A sound of silver trumpets rang through the air. Hoofbeats chattered in the cobbled streets. Clear the way, make way for the king. All the people rushed to the sidewalks. They drove their carts right up to over the cobblestones. Bartholomew clutched his basket tighter. Around the corner dashed 50 trumpets on the yellow-robed horses. Behind the crimson-robed horses came the king's own guards. "Hats off to the king!" shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On the king's carriage, white and gold and purple, it rumbled like a thunder through the narrow street. It swept past Bartholomew. Then suddenly its mighty brakes shrieked, it lurched, and then it stopped. The whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe his weight in his eyes. Through the side of the window on the carriage, the king himself was staring back. Straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. Back up. The king commanded to the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guard shouted to the crimson-robed horses. The trumpeters shouted to their yellow-robed horses. Very slowly the whole procession backed down the street until the king's carriage stopped right in front of the Bartholomew. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes undecently on Bartholomew Cubbins. Well, he demanded. Bartholomew shook his with fright. I ought to say something, thought he to himself, but he couldn't think of nothing to say. Well, demanded the king, said, do you or do you not take off your hat before your king? Yes, sire, answered Bartholomew, feeling greatly relieved. I do take off the hat before the king. Then take it off this very instant, commanded the king more loudly than before. But sire, my hat is off, answered Bartholomew. Such impudence, shouted the king, shaking the angry finger. How dare you stand there and tell me your hat is off? I don't like to say you're wrong, sire, but Bartholomew very proudly says my hat is off, and he showed the king the hat in his hand. If that's your hat and your head, demanded, then what's on your head? On my head, because there did seem something strange on his head. He reached up and hand touched the hat. The face of the Cubbins turned very red. "It's a hat, sire," he stammered, "but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head." "I don't care how it got there," said the king. "Take it off." And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew quickly snatched off his hat, and he stared at his astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat, the same size, the same color, and had exactly the same feather. "By the crown of my fathers," where the king again leaned out in his carriage window, "did or not command you to take off your hat?" "You did, sire. I took it off. I looked over it twice." "Nonsense. There's still a hat upon your head." "Another hat?" Again Bartholomew reached up his hand and touched the hat. Come on. "What's the meaning of this?" demanded the king in pearl-faced rage. "I don't know, sire. I never happened to before." The king was now shaking with such fear that the carriage rocked him heels and royal coachman that he sat in the seat. "Attest the impudent trickster," said the king, and the captain of the king's own guard will teach him to take off his hat. The royal coachman cracked his long whip, and the king's carriage swung forward up the street toward the palace. But the captain of the king's own guards leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced over the cobblestones and rolled down into the gutter. With a jingling of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain of Bartholomew sped up, winding down the street toward the palace. Out of the narrow streets up the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped, post back right gardens of the wealthy urchins. Higher and higher up the mountains, or past the walls of Noman's classes. Flop! The sharp wind whisked the Bartholomew's hat. Flop, flop. Two more flew off. Flop, flop, flew another, and another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. Lords and ladies staring at him with the windows up the streets shutters, wondering what the strange stream of hats could mean. Over the palace of drawbridge they sped through the great gates into the corridor. The captain pulled off his reins. "His Majesty waits the throne room," said the captain of the throne room. The captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. "I certainly hate to be in his shoes," he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king had nothing to do dreadful to punish me, because I really haven't done anything wrong. I haven't cowardly or been afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders, marched straight up to the palace, followed the black carpet and the guard at the door, and although this long, shining Bartholomew could hear the muttering of the voices behind the heavy doors. He would take off his hat. No, he would not take off his hat. Bartholomew walked until the stood in the middle of the throne room. The king, in a long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside the stood Aloud, keeper of the king's records. He wore his belt instead of a sword and a long silver ruler. Lords and nobles of the court Solomon cider. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. "Young man, I'll give you one more chance. You will take off your hat for the king." "Your Majesty," Bartholomew as polite as he possibly could. "I will, but I'm afraid that won't do any good." He took off his hat, and he didn't do any good. Another his hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off the hat after that until he was standing in the middle of the room in a pile of hats. The lords and nobles were astonished, but they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. "Heavens," said Sire Aloud, keeper of the records, blinking to be behind his triangle spectacles. "He's taken out 45, and there's 3 more down the town," said the king, "and you must be at 87 more below off the head of the gallop of the sword." Bartholomew's trying to be helpful. 135 hats, most unusual," said Sire Aloud, writing down the long scroll. Come, said the king impatiently. "Sir Aloud, what do you make of this nonsense?" "Very seriously nonsense, your Majesty," said Sir Aloud. "I advise you call in an expert on hats." "Excellent," said the king. "Ho, guard, fetch me Sir Sneetches, maker of hats of all the fine lords." Into the throne marched the smallest man, wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Sneetches. Instead of a sword, he wore aside a large pair of scissors. They took his body hat, and Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbins' hat and sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed sniffily. Your Majesty, I, Snips, am the maker of hats and all the fine lords. I make hats in cloth of gold, fine silks and gems and ostrich plums. You ask me what I think of this hat. It's the most ordinary hat I've ever seen in my eyes. In that case, said the king, it should be very simple for you to take it off. Simply, indeed, mumbled Sir Nose triflingly, he said, standing on the tiptoes, and he pushed the pudgy thumb of Bartholomew's hat and knocked on the floor. Immediately another appeared on Bartholomew's Mill's hat. Streebs! Cried the servants, leaping to the higher, ran and then tall, then turned, ran shrieking out of the room. Dear me, said the king, looking very puzzled. If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat. 136. Sir Aloud, winking at his bow. Your Majesty, I advise you to call in your wise men. A fine idea, said the king. Oh, guard, bring me Nad. Nad knows about everything on all my kingdom. In comes an old man. He looked like a hat on Bartholomew's head. He looked at a pile of hats on the floor. Nad, my wise man, can you take off this hat? Asked the king. Nad shook his head, slowly no. Then fetch me the king, father of Nad, the command of the king. He knows about everything in my kingdom and all the world beyond. It came an even older man, but when his father brought him hats, the father of Nad merely locked his fingers across the beard and said nothing. Then bring me the father of the Nad, ordered the king. He knows about everything in all my kingdom and all the world beyond, and in other words that might happen to be. Then came the oldest man of them all. He just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously the end of the beard. Does this mean that no one in the whole kingdom could take off this boy's hat? Bellowed the king in a terrified voice, a small voice, up in the balcony window. What's the matter, Uncle Derwin? To Bartholomew it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped out of the balcony and he leaned over the marble railing. There's a boy here, just about your age. King said he won't take off his hat. Bartholomew tiptoed up to the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big glass collar. A very proud little boy with his nose near with the Grand Duke Wilfred, nephew of the king. You sent me down here, said Grand Duke Wilfred. It'll fix him. The king thought for a moment. He pushed back his crown, scattered his head. Well, maybe you can, but there's no harm trying. Take him to the Grand Duke Wilfred, commander of the king. Two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. Pooh, said the Grand Duke Wilfred, looking at the Bartholomew's hat and laughing merrily. That hat won't come off, said over there. He pointed to the corner where the wall was covered up. I need a little target practice with my bow and an arrow. When Bartholomew saw the Grand Duke Wilfred had only a child's bow, he didn't feel frightened. He spoke proudly. I can shoot my father's big arrow. My bow is plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours, answered. He let the fly and arrows graze his forehead and snip off his hat. Away it blew over the target. Yet another hat appeared off his head. These arrows flew. The Grand Duke's whole bag full of arrows was gone, and still a hat sat upon his head. It's not fair, said the Grand Duke. It's not fair. He threw down the bow and stamped on it. 154 hats, gulped Sir Aloud. These hats are driving me mad. The king's voice rang out through all the palace. Why waste time on a child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow realm. Fetch me yeoman and bowman. Yeoman and bowman. Echoed all the lords and nobles in the court. The gigantic man strolled out across the terrace and bowed as a big branch of the tree. The arrow was twice as long as the Bartholomew and thicker than the twist. Yeoman and bowman. Shoot off his boy's hat. Make it stay off. Bartholomew was trembling so hard that he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back to his mighty bow. Looked like a mad giant hornet. An arrow tore through the air toward Bartholomew Cubbins. A sharp arrowhead bit through his hat and carried it off and then pulled for half a mile. It plunked up to a stop his oak tree, yet the Bartholomew's head sat on another hat. The face of yeoman and bowman went through the palace walls, and black magic, he shrieked. Black magic is what it is, said Cyrus with relief. It should have been before, but my thing's simple. Back throne, call me magicians. In the whole throne, there wasn't a sound of a hole out of his breath. From the spiral staircase led down the southwest corner came the shuffling old snow. Paddle feet, magicians were coming. Low and slow, they were changing words, and they were strange. Dig a hole 5 furlongs deep, down where the night snaps creak. Mix and mold the whole majestic mud, Malber, Balber, Titter, and Tud. It came 7 brown magicians. Beside each stalking leaned black hat. A circle of those Cubbins muttered deep and mysterious sounds. Stop this useless muttering, ordered the king. I want to chant the hard charm of this boy's hat. The magicians muttered Bartholomew and chanted, Winkle bus, tinkle bus, faulty he clay, hat of the demon's head, fly far away. How man, how away, how away, how away. Yole cats, yole away, yole away, yole away. Hat on his demon's head, step away, keep away, leap away, never come back. A mighty door chant, said the king, looking very pleased. And you sure it will work? All the magicians nodded together. But, said the king, looking puzzled, there still seems to be a hat upon his head. How long will it take for the charm to work? Be calm, or have no fears, chanted the magician. Our charm will work in 10 short years. 10 years, gasped the king. Away, fools, he shouted. Out of my sight, can't wait 10 years to get rid of this hat. Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do? If I were king, whispered the Grand Duke Wilfred, I'd chop off his head. A dreadful thought, the king biting his lip, but I'm afraid I'll have to. Young man, said Bartholomew Cubbins, and he pointed off the small door in another room. March down those steps to the dungeon and tell the king to chop off your head. Bartholomew's heart sank into the boots, and he did as the king commanded. I must take off your hat, he said to himself as he started down the long back stairway. This is my last chance. Once hat after another tore his head. 156, 58. He grew colder and damper. 217, 218, 219, down, 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 down. It seemed that Bartholomew must have been in the very heart of the mountain. Who's there? Said the voice of the blackness. Bartholomew turned the corner and stepped into the dungeon. The cashier was whistling and singing and acted idly, because at that moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed a very pleasant man. The king says, must chop off my head, Bartholomew. Oh, I hate to. The secretary looked at him with a friendly smile. You seem like such a nice boy. Well, the king says you have to. So, please get it over with. All right. But first you got to take off your hat. Why? So, I don't know, said the secretary, but once you have the rules, I can't excuse anyone with his hat on. All right, Bartholomew, you take off for me. All right. The secretary leaned across the chopping block, flew his hat. What's this? He grasped, blinking through the holes in the mask. As another hat sat on Bartholomew, he flipped this one on, and then another and another. Fiddlesticks, grunted the executioner, throwing his axe on the floor. I can't execute you at all. And then shook hands with the Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. The king had been keeping a nap on the throne. What are you doing back here? Said Bartholomew, angry with being awakened. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, explained Bartholomew. My head can't come off with a hat on. It's against the rules. So it can't. So the king leaned back really. Now, how many hats have you made it all together? The executioner knocked off 13, but I left 178 more on the dungeon steps, answered Bartholomew. So 346 hats. Aloud called behind the school. Uncle Derwin, yon the Grand Duke of Wilfred, I suppose I have to do it to some. Sent him up to the highest turret and in person, and I'll push him off. Wilford, I'm surprised at you, Mr. King, but I guess it's a good idea. So the King and Grand Duke led Bartholomew Cubbins toward the highest turret. Up and up and up turned stars and climbed behind him. This is the last and very last chance, thought Bartholomew. He snatched off his hat. 347. He snatched another, pulled off another, hung behind him. 398, 399. His arms arched, pulling off hats, but still the hats came off. Bartholomew climbed on. 448, 449, 450. Counting his relic, pulled off and off the stairs behind him. Suddenly, Eric stopped. He looked at his office, triangular, spectacular, and whipped him off his sleeve. And then he looked again. That hat began to change. That's 451, not one, but two feathers. 452, 3, 5, all little red jewel. Each new hat was fancier than the hat was just before. Your Majesty, cried out Sir Alec. But the King and Grand Duke were way up there, but they couldn't hear. They had already reached the top of the highest turret. Bartholomew was following just behind. Step right out there, get off the wall, snapped Grand Duke Wilford. I can't wait to push you off. But when Bartholomew stepped up in the wall, they grasped with amazement. He was wearing the most beautiful hat in the world I've ever seen. The King of did. It had ruby roger than the King himself had ever owned. It was an ostrich plumes, cockatoo plumes, and mockingbird plumes, paradise plumes. Besides such a hat, even the King's own crown seemed like nothing. The Grand Duke Wilford took a quick step. Bartholomew knew who come last. Wait, shouted the King. He could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. I won't wait, Grand Duke. Talk about the King. I'm going to push him off now. That new big hat makes me madder than ever. And he flung his arm and pushed Bartholomew off. But the King was quicker than Wilford. He grabbed him by the back of his lace collar. This will teach you, Miss Majesty, sternly. The Grand Dukes never talked back to the King, and he turned Grand Duke Wilford over his knee and spanked him suddenly, right off the seat in royal skink pants. And now, smiled the King, lifting Bartholomew down from the wall, it would be nice if you sell them wonderful hat. 498, 499. Broke in a tired voice, Raleigh, who just arrived at the top of the steps, and that. He pointed to his hat at Bartholomew's head. That makes exactly 500. 500, claimed the King. I will now sell it for 500 pieces of gold. Anything you say, sire, answered Bartholomew. You see, I've never sold one before. The King's hat trembled with joy and reached forward to the hat. Slowly, Bartholomew felt weight of his great hat lifting from his head. He held his breath, then suddenly he felt the cool evening breeze blow through the hat. His face broke onto the smiling, happy face. It said Bartholomew Cubbins was brave. Look, Your Majesty, look, shouted to the King. Now you look at me, answered the King. You put a great hat on over his crown, arm in arm. The King and Bartholomew went down the corridor, counting all the gold. Then the King sent Bartholomew home to his parents. No basket on his arm, no hat on his head, but 500 pieces of gold in the bag. And the King commanded that the hat had been bought, and all the other hats too, kept forever in great crystal cases by the side-by-side throne. But neither Bartholomew Cubbins nor King Derwin himself nor anyone else in the kingdom did ever explain how the strange thing happened. They only could say it just happened and happened, not very likely to happen again.